Day 10. Excellent. Okay, so we left off yesterday with a new view for our settings, and we were talking about storing our settings. We only have one setting that we want to store right now, which is whether the user wants notifications or not. And we will use this value to check if we should prompt them to allow notifications, because they have to give us permission. So we'll handle it there. Okay, so let's jump into it. We have our code here. Remember, we did some notification stuff yesterday, 2 days ago, and it was quite a lot. So let's start by working on the settings view that we created yesterday. And here's our application. It's running. Give yourself a gift, the present moment, Marcus Aurelius. Excellent. I mentioned this previously. You probably have noticed this. All these quotes are Marcus Aurelius quotes. That's because in the CSV, he's very front-loaded at the front of the CSV. So we'll come up with a way to kind of like randomize that too at some point. But we're not going to worry about that for right now. So if you click this gear, it takes you to the settings screen. And we use this library called Settings UI that makes building setting screens really, really easy. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file in our settings module called settingsViewModel.dart. I'm going to open the quote view model. I'm going to copy everything here, and then I'm going to paste that in the settings view model. It's going to be fairly different. We'll change a bunch of stuff, but for the most part, the boilerplate, the structure of this file is going to be the same. So if we go here and select everything from quote view, and we hit Command D, we will continue to select matches in VS Code. If you're using another editor, you're on your own on this one. There are a lot of different ways to tackle that. But I don't know them. So we have our quote view model, yep. Okay, let's keep going, and we're back at the top. Now that we're back at the top, hit backspace and change this to settings view model. So just type settings view. That'll update all of these so they have the correct name. Okay, this is pretty good. I think what we're going to do is we will probably use another box for this. This one probably won't be lazy since we're only storing one value. We can load it into memory. Another option, I do want to talk about this because this is normally what I would recommend. And I'll explain why we're not doing this in just a second. There's a shared preferences API. The name shared preferences in particular, is a really good indicator that maybe you should use this API if you're managing preferences. But it wraps platform-specific persistent storage, so NS user defaults, shared preferences on Android. These are basically, they're key value stores that are meant to store basic things. So on iOS and Android, they don't really provide you with this is how you use a database in your application. And honestly, a lot of times you might not want to. In fact, it's pretty common that you would build a iOS or Android application or web application, desktop application that communicates with an API and doesn't really store any data locally, or may store some data locally, but not a lot of data locally. And that API is a server, like a web server, that connects to a database and stores all of it there. I always use like Facebook or Twitter as an example. Whenever you go to facebook.com, you pull up a web client for Facebook. Same with Twitter. There is a server. There's thousands of servers, but bear with me. There is a server somewhere that your web client will make a request to, and that server will read data from the database, do a bunch of what we would call business logic, which is making the data relevant for the use case that Facebook is trying to solve. and then it will return that data to your web client, and then your web client will update the browser, and that's what you see. That's a really, really high level of like the intricacies of how that all fits together. So don't try to interview and use that as an explanation for like explain how the browser requests data, because it's not. There's so much more to it. But the point that I'm getting at is like you might not always use a database in your application. We use one because we have no API. We have no way to store it. We don't want that. I don't want to manage accounts. I don't want to manage data. I want to let the device manage the data, and then we also have a really lax privacy policy. I shouldn't say lax. That makes it sound like it's not strict. But we have a very easy privacy policy because we're not collecting anything. That will change. We'll probably include Crashlytics and maybe another tool just to help us see if people are using our application and how they're using it and if it crashes. But the point that I'm getting at is it keeps things simple. Okay. You can see how to use this. It's really easy. You get an instance of shared preferences. You set a value. The reason that the more I look at this, the more I'm like, maybe we should just use this. The reason that I was thinking we shouldn't use this is we already have a mechanism for storing data on our device. It's Hive. Yeah, let's just use Hive. Okay, so I'm going to create a new file called settings.dart, and we're going to add, I'm actually just going to copy quote entry and paste it here. Change this from quote entry to settings. Change this to settings. This will change to settings. We don't need this. Entry with date time. Okay, we don't need this. This is actually going to be really easy because all we need is a bool. Once notifications. We'll give this a box name. I'm just going to call it settings. Oh, and then we do need to give this a constant constructor required this dot once notifications. And semicolon. Okay, so we ran this earlier. I'm going to pull up my terminal. I'm going to go to Philosopher's Stone, and we ran Flutter pub run build runner build. We ran this the last time we were generating stuff with Hive. This is, as a reminder, this is the script that is parsing our source code, looking for Hive type. Oh, hang on. We have an issue. Sorry, cancel build. I am glad we caught this. Looking for Hive type with a type ID. These need to be unique. We copied 0. We want to change this to 1. Make sure this is 1, not 0. And then Hive fields and generating code for our storage mechanism. Okay. Found one declared outputs, which already exists on the disk. This is likely because the build folder was deleted or submitting generated files into your source repository. Delete these files. Yeah, we can delete them. Let this run again. Okay. Now we have settings G Dart, which is excellent. Technically, so we could also just store like a Boolean value in Hive. The reason we create a class right here is there's a chance in the future we may want to add more settings besides once notifications. Having everything in a class like this instead of just storing the Boolean in a box makes it so we can extend this class with new properties whenever we want to add new settings. It's a little bit of premature optimization, but it's the premature optimization that I would consider to be the good kind, thinking a little bit about what the future use case could look like and choosing an abstraction for that. You also may agree that that's not really premature optimization, and that's fine too. The point that I'm getting at is I think it's a good move, so we're going to do that. Okay, So now that we're back here, we can go to our settings view model, and we want to load our settings. And we're going to change this from quote to settings. We will remove this field since we don't have entries on this screen. We'll change this one to settings. We can keep our loading state. We can keep an error message state. We're going to change this from a lazy box to a box. This box will be settings. That's the type of item that's stored in the box. An easy way to remember this, these are called generics. If you're not familiar with generics, an easy way to remember this is we have a box with some values in it. It looks like this value is in the box. Like if you consider this to be the edge of the box, and you consider this to be the other edge of the box, this is the value that we're putting in that box. Okay, and then we can update this to settings.boxName. Okay. I like our state stream that we did last time, our getter for the state. We'll keep that as is. We need to change this because these fields don't exist anymore, and instead we have settings, and it'll just be settings. We have to fetch those, right? So we don't need this select quote for date stuff anymore. Oops, I deleted one too many lines, sorry. So we don't need any of this anymore, which means we don't need this anymore. And we will keep the submit entry method. We'll change it a little bit in the future. Actually, for now, let's just go ahead and remove it all. And then we can remove this as well. Actually, sorry, let's keep that. Let's keep that. We'll change this to settings, and this will be get settings. This will be box.get, and returns the key associated with the given. Okay, if the key does not exist, null is returned. So this is where it like is a little weird, right? Because so our box is a key value storage mechanism. So we have to give this a key, and this key is slightly redundant because we're not storing other values for settings. So I'm just going to call it settings. We can actually, it would probably behoove us to pull this out somewhere and maybe do something like const box key settings box key is equal to settings. Okay, static const. And then down here, we can say settings view model dot settings box key. Okay, that's going to return a settings for us, or maybe a settings, I should clarify. And then let's go ahead and get that value here. So we can call this method that we wrote called get settings. It takes in a quote. We don't want it to take in a quote, so let's remove that. The quote's not being used, so that's fine. Okay, undefined name settings, so let's set this to a variable. And then we need to await this. Excuse me. And then what I want to do is one of two things. Actually, so we have a couple options. We always want settings, right? If you don't have settings, we just want the default value. So this is a little interesting. We can either wrap this in parentheses and do a null coalescence and something like settings, and then set once notifications probably to false by default. This would work, but we have a slightly cleaner API for this. And the way this is handled is that we have a default value right here. Okay, so now that we have this default value, this won't return a, I wish the API would update, but there's not really a way for them to do that, is there? So there's I guess there's still technically a chance that this returns null. But this will use the default value if it can't find anything at that key. So now that we're here, will be risky, and we will do a the bang operator, or the exclamation mark, which basically says, I know you think this is null, I'm telling you it's not going to be null. This is generally not a great practice. In fact, we probably should do something a little nicer, which would be taking this value and saying if settings is equal to null, else paste, if null, we'll copy the settings view model failed piece, add an error message, failed to load settings. In theory, this should never happen, but if I had a nickel for every time I said that in software development and it did happen, I probably wouldn't need to work anymore. Okay, so we save that. Let's change one more thing. Our submit entry is going to be save settings. We're going to take in a settings object. Okay, that's pretty good. Pretty happy with this. And then we want to, let's go ahead and store this, right? So we can make this really easy. We have our settings key. I just gave this a name, settings box key. There we go. Box.put settings box key, and then we just want to put the settings. And all this does is takes the value that we provide it and puts it in the box, waits for that to finish, and then returns. Again, this is something that can fail, so this is something you may want to try catch. Or in our case, since it can fail, we can just handle it in the UI when it does fail. Okay, so now we have our settings view model set up. So let's go back to settings view. Let me just check something and make sure. Okay, we are still recording. I got really nervous there for a second. Okay, so we want to do a couple things. We have our settings list, our settings sections. I will probably put our settings list in a stream builder. So we have a stream builder just like we did last time. So we have a stream that we need, which we'll get to in just a second. And then we have a builder function, which is a context and a snapshot, just like last time. And then I'm going to return the value that I cut the settings list right there. We need to use our stream, so let's set up a view model. Settings view model equals settings view model. This should be a lowercase s. Don't know why it changed that on me. So we have our settings view model. It has a default value, so we can say settings view model dot state. Sorry. And then in our init state for our settings view state, we'll have to add this method. We want to call super init state, always call super. And then now we want to say settings view model dot get settings. Okay. I just saved and it immediately threw an error. It said box not found. Did you forget to call Hive open box? Sort of. We actually hadn't written that line of code yet, but so yeah, we did, I guess, forget to call it. So let's say await hive.openbox, and then we need to pass in the type. So, well, I guess we don't need to pass in the type, but we're going to pass in the type. And this will be settings.boxname. And this is in our main file, main.dart. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that, but we'll go to main.dart and we'll add this line. Okay. Now we need to do a refresh, or a restart. See, it restarted the application. There's an error message from last time. So now that we're here, we can click on this, and our value doesn't change because we haven't written that code yet. But in theory, our view model is working. So let's go back to our settings view. We want to do a couple things. So this initial value is based on that settings view. So we'll come up to line 30 for me, the start of the builder function that we just added. We'll type if snapshot dot has error. So if we have a snapshot error or parentheses snapshot dot has data and snapshot dot data is settings error settings view model failed. Okay. Then we want to do return center text. Oops, sorry, child text. Something went wrong. I know that's not the most helpful error message, but it's something to start with. Okay, now if we come back here and we say something like if snapshot.hasData. So one thing I want to talk about really quick is I just said if it has data. And we know that that data could be an error state, right? We have an error state right here called settings view model failed. This is data and it's an error state. We won't run into that scenario here because we check for it here and then we're returning early. So if this is true, this code will never be executed. I'm going to add one more line at the bottom of this if statement to make our editor happy. And this is return center child circular progress indicator, an instant classic. Let's make this const. And now let's try to load this screen. It's hard to tell if it is actually working. I'm going to do a hard restart. Okay, that initial value is... Oh, we aren't actually changing it. Sorry, we wrapped everything. So we're getting into a scenario where we do have data. We're just not actually using it. Sorry about that. Let's use that. Snapshot.data. Okay, so we have data, but we don't know what type it is, right? So in our case, we can do and snapshot.data is view model loaded, which is great, except for this doesn't help us out down here. This is still not necessarily bad, and I think I'll keep this line because that way it makes sure that if we have data and it is loaded, then we want to show this view. But I'm gonna do something called type promotion. We've talked about this in previous episodes too. It's really annoying that Dart kind of makes us do this, but it's because Dart can't figure this out on its own and it wants to be type safe. It chooses type safety over making guesses about type safety and a slightly better developer experience. So what we can do here is I can say final data is equal to snapshot.data as quote view model loaded. And technically that's not type promotion. Type promotion would be if we had this pulled out to like here in a variable and then we checked it here. This is just type coercion. In Dart, you can kind of, they're not the exact same thing. They're actually different. They're fairly different, but they solve a lot of the same problems. So it's kind of easy to confuse the two, or at least it is for me. So we have data dot, why is this quote view model loaded? That's not what we want. We want settings view model loaded. Sorry about that. And then this would be data dot settings dot once notifications. Okay. I'm going to remove this import that got automatically added for me since we don't need it. And now, okay, let's load this screen. Oh, it doesn't look like it's loading. So one thing we can do is we can add a debugger right here by clicking this little area. This is called the gutter. Clicking the gutter over here in line with this if statement. So on line 38, Then if we do a hot reload, you can see that we've opened our debugger, our debugging experience, and it stopped right here. We've debugged once before because I see box.keys, so I know that we've done something before. So we can see here, settings view model loaded. No, loading. Okay, so it's loading. Okay. Interesting. So let's go back to our view model. And I guess just to clarify before we do, we're not getting into this loaded state. So let's take a look at our view model and make sure we are emitting a loaded state. And then we can also look at adding a debugger on a couple different lines right here. You can add as many breakpoints as you want. You can also choose to just add a single breakpoint and then use tools like step over, step into. I always get those confused, so I generally opt towards multiple breakpoints. Okay, so we call get settings. Oh, okay, we're clearly calling the wrong thing. It's not get settings. It should be load settings. And then maybe to make sure this doesn't happen again, since this was still a quote one, we make get settings private. So if we add an underscore to this, and the easiest way to do this would be to refactor, I'm sorry, not refactor, rename. So if you right click and rename or press F2 and then put a little underscore right here, it's going to tell us down here that it'll be invisible in settings view. Yeah, that's fine. That's because we're calling the wrong thing. So we do that, rename, it adds an underscore for us. We can see that it uses an underscore here. Okay, now we go back to our settings view and we change this from get settings to load settings. Let's call it that. And remember, load settings is the value that we just renamed this to on line 38. Okay, we'll come back, trigger this once more. Great, so we are actually calling load settings this time. I'm gonna have faith and remove all these breakpoints and just continue on. Okay, yeah, so we loaded it and our state is set to no. This works pretty well. So what we're gonna do is in our settings view, we'll come back to our switch tile and we'll call settings view model dot save settings, and then we'll set this equal to the value. So this value will be true or false based on the state of the toggle, and we just want to save our settings in that state. So now that we're here, if we press this, cannot write unknown type settings. Did you forget to register an adapter? We did. We did forget to register an adapter. Let's do that. Okay, so if we go back to main.dart, hive.register adapter, settings, adapter. Since this is in our main method, before our application starts, which is way down here, we want to hit the restart button. There's already a type adapter for type ID 1. Oops. This should be type ID 2. This is one of the things they warn you about in Hive, is make sure that these are unique, and I did not make sure. So we had two other fields defined, one at 0 and one at 1, or two other types defined, one at 0 and one at 1. So this one needs to be 2. I'm going to take a sip of my beverage while this launches. Okay. Let's let this launch. Ooh, sorry. I just rolled into my mic. So this is an interesting state. The app is right here. If we were to click this, it would be the previous version of the app, or the version that is the last time we launched. So we need to wait for this to finish. Despite it looking like it's ready for us, it's not. When it launches itself from VS Code, that is how you know it's good to go. Like that. There's already a type adapter for type ID 1. Okay, so in Hive, sorry, I've feel like I should remember this from the start instead of debugging my way through it. But this type ID is used in the adapter. The adapter is built by running flutter pub run build runner build. So I'm going to run this again. If it prompts us to clear out old files, we'll clear them out. Okay, it didn't need to. So let's take a look at settings G Dart. This is the generated file. We talked about this previously. We see the type ID is set to 2. Okay, we should be good to go now. I'm going to launch the application one more time. It'll take a minute, hopefully not a minute, but maybe 10 or 15 seconds to get started. And then we can validate that we are saving the user's preference on whether they're notified or not. And one thing nice about boxes as opposed to lazy boxes are that they are kept in memory. So those values are really, oops, I just rolled into my mic again, sorry. Those values are on hand pretty quickly. So we're tapping this. We can almost force it to change color with basic interaction. Our issue here is actually quite simple. So if we go to settings view, we are saving our settings, but we're not reloading our settings, right? So what we probably want to do here is await box.put, and then we probably want to trigger a load settings call. Now, again, the question is, do we want to wait for this before returning? And I think not. So we'll await for the put. That way we know that the value has been updated, but we don't need to await the load settings call. Okay, let's try this now. Great. It's actually toggleable. Now that we've clicked allow notifications, let's navigate away and come back. And it's still checked. Click it one more time, navigate away, come back, click it one more time, come back to VS Code, restart the application, hit settings, and it's still checked. Okay, we're storing our settings preferences, which is what we set out to do today, but it's not quite really meeting the mark yet. So one more thing we'll want to look at is adding that check to prompt people to allow notifications. I need to remember where we do this, where we prompt people. I do believe it's quote view. Set up notification scheduling. Okay. So one thing I want to do is I am going to pull up the simulator, close that out, go to settings. The settings, okay. I thought settings might not actually work. Philosopher's Stone, notifications, turn off notifications. Okay, and then what I want to do is I'm going to restart the application so that view initializes again. Do keep in mind we're calling that an init state, so we'll need to initialize the state to trigger this. And in our case, we need to restart the application. Right? Request permissions. Oh, interesting. Requests the specified permissions from the user and returns the current permission status. Okay, sorry, I went quiet for a second. I'm not sure why that's not triggering. I expected that to trigger right here, but it does not seem to be triggering. So one thing we can do is I can put a debugger right there, restart the application, see if the debugger triggers. It does, which is great. Let's see if we get to this line. Okay, yeah, periodically show, we do. Notification details. Okay, so it is being configured to run. Interesting. I'm not quite sure why that is having an issue. Or why it's not prompting the actual device with the pop-up. But that's fine, we can work around this. So if we go to quote view model, we're going to add another method. This one's not going to manipulate our state because it's not really about the view model state. It's more about like an auxiliary interaction that we want to trigger if the user is, what's a good way to put this? If the user has certain values set. So we'll scroll to the bottom. We'll add a future settings. Let's say that it won't be nullable and it'll be get settings. And it will be async. And we will, so ideally we would have this in a way where we can easily reuse the code from one to the next. You don't really want a view model that points to another view model. So you'd extract these out to like another layer called like a service. And then you would have your quote view model pull in like your settings service and your settings view model pull in your settings service. Excuse me. And excuse me again. Oh, geez. Manage all of that for you. But instead, I think we're just going to make this really simple and say final settings box equals box. Open box, is that what it is? I don't remember, and we just did it. Hive, okay. So it should just be Hive box. And this isn't a quote entry, this is a settings object, and this uses the settings box name. And we just want to return settingsbox.get, and then the key, as we know, is settings. This isn't clean, really at all, so we should probably see if we can improve that because it has a value of future settings. Can't be returned. Okay, so it would be nullable in this case. This is kind of bad. We don't really want this arbitrary string right here. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another constant here called static const string box key. And we'll just call that settings as well. And then now if we go back to our view model, instead of pointing to, sorry, this is our settings view model. Instead of pointing to the settings view model, settings box key, we just point to settings.box key. We can go up to our settings box key and remove it. We have to fix that here too though, right? So settings.box key. And now we can go back to our quote. Oh, did I just quit VS Code? I guess I did. I'm so sorry about that. Let's get that fixed. Interesting. What was Command Q, I guess? I was trying to Alt Tab. Wild. Okay, so I'll slow down my typing so I don't do that again. So if we go back to our quote view model, and right here, this is settings.box key. So this is going to get our settings. I'm going to start my application again. Since I closed VS Code, the connection between my simulator and my editor and the language server and Dart itself has terminated. So I'm going to restart mine. You don't need to restart yours unless you also accidentally closed VS Code. Okay, so we wrote this line in our quote view model. We're going to go back to our quote view. And what we're going to do here is take this line, set up notification scheduling, and cut, so Command X. And then we want to do something like final settings equals quote view model dot settings. Actually, no, we'll keep this. We'll keep up set up notification scheduling. And what we'll do here is we'll actually do the check before we do any of this. And the reason why is that we can't have async await code in this. So we could like chain things with promises or futures or whatever you want to call them. Futures is the correct term in Dart, called promises in JavaScript. But we could chain it, but I kind of like the way this is laid out. So instead, I'd rather take the cruft and push it to this method. So if our final settings equals quote viewModel.getSettings, we need to await this value. And the reason we await this is because we can't run anything else beyond this until we know what the settings look like. So I selected everything down to the catch and I cut it. And I'm going to say if settings.onceNotifications, then paste. Format, we have a slight error here, and that's because this could be null. So a way we can do this is we can default to false. That's generally a very good practice. So if we do settings.onceNotifications or false. I know this isn't or, this is a null coalescence, but you can kind of think of it as an or in this case. Or looks like this. Those are called or bars. In our case, we're defaulting to false. So if they want notifications, default to false. Then we call all this code. So we won't run this if they don't want notifications. And that way we won't prompt them for their permission for notifications. I'm curious if this plugin, I'm going to do a little bit of exploring really quick. Get active notifications, initialize, periodically show. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious if there was a way to see through this plugin if the user has granted permission to the underlying operating system. So there's one thing that we kind of don't have, right? Like the user could grant permissions and to have notifications, but if they turn this to false, we won't schedule more notifications for them. So it would be nice if we had a way to kind of keep this in sync. So if you did grant us permissions, we would default this to true. It's a nice thing, but it's not really a requirement. So we probably won't worry about that at this point in time. Okay, so we wrote a lot of code. Sorry, my brain's a little scattered today, so this one might have not have been as good as the rest, but I appreciate you sticking with me and us working on another view model and kind of wiring that up. I have been kind of looking over the code that we've written so far, and there's a lot of things that we could clean up specifically around the notifications and the setup for those. So unless I have another idea, my plan probably for tomorrow will be to clean that up a little bit so we feel proud about our code, which is always a good feeling. And then after that, we probably will look at getting this deployed on a physical device. So getting it deployed on my iPhone for test flight, and we'll talk about test flight and what that is. And then I've also got an Android device over there that will deploy to through the Play Store. The Play Store has tracks, and we'll use the internal testing track to deploy our application to our phone. And then we can, maybe if we have time this year, we'll talk about getting it deployed to actual users in the App Store in production so they can set everything up. Oh, but before we do that, we'll probably set up Crashlytics. So that's kind of a plan for what I'm thinking of as we move forward, and we'll see how everything goes. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like videos like this. This is kind of the new format that I'm pushing forward this year, at the end of this year at least. And then I'd like to do more of this, maybe not at this frequency, but more of this next year as well, with other projects like maybe an Express server is something I've been looking at. I like Go, Dart. Sometimes I like Rust, so maybe we'll do some stuff in Rust as well. But it'll just be a fun opportunity to learn new things and kind of broaden your horizons. Also, subscribe. Yep. There's a bell. If you click that, you'll get notifications whenever I publish new videos, which means you don't have to miss anything. And especially if I keep doing stuff that builds on the previous stuff, you really don't want to miss a day. So consider doing that, and then let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear how your app is coming along. Have you done anything differently? Have you taken what we've been building and said, maybe I want to do this instead? Or what quotes are you using? I'd love to know more. So leave me a comment below and I'll read through those and I'll respond to every single one. Have a great Monday.